I know.
It's what we normally do.
Oh, we do, yeah. So now we'd like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Ruairi McKiernan, the founder and former CEO of Spunout.ie. That's a very hard act to follow. I'm very sorry about that. Crap.
Can I do it? Who owns the drum? Do you mind if I have a go?
Reggie owns it.
Jesus, I saw the drum and I started going, will I or won't I? Will I or won't I? So I did. Sometimes that's what participation is like, when you kind of want to participate and then you crap yourself. And then you go, bugger it, it's now or never, you've only got one life. So sometimes you have to grab the drum. But also it's good to ask permission as well. Thanks for invite me to speak here. I have this little kind of mysterious gateway on the slides because in some ways I've been at this kind of work for about 15 years, and the more I feel like I learn and the more I know, it feels like the less I know. Does anyone sort of identify with that? So it just feels like this eternal mystery, and I know the conference is called, what is it? We're on the way, or so we're on the way, we're on the one road, maybe the wrong road, but we're on the way, and hopefully there's a bright light there. My disclaimer is that, it's partially touched on my introduction, but I'm not an academic, I'm not a professor, I'm probably not qualified. A lot of my experience is just by doing, and so I'm not going to bamboozle you with theory in this. It's more just my offering of my experience with not just young people, and as a former young person, yes, and also about participation in general, because sometimes we're talking about participation and we talk about them and we talk about the young people, and we don't really talk about us as adults and the participation in our lives or in our workplaces or in society at large. So I think it is important to talk about participation. And I don't know who this guy is, apologies, his photo ended up on the internet and I took it. So be careful what you put online, but I'm guessing he gave his permission. But what I'm getting at here is that I think it's important when we talk about participation or working with young people that we have a good look in the mirror. And sometimes when we look in the mirror, the reflection you see back isn't really what you thought you were or are. And in some ways, it's important to have a critique or to be up for the challenge. If I'm to challenge you, you might not be as responsive as if you were to challenge yourself. And I think the journey we're all on is one of growth, and that's why you make the effort to come to events like this, because you're seeking to learn and seeking to grow and seeking to improve. And that's what TUSLA is seeking to do. And I'd like to think that as a country, that's what we need to do, is take a good hard look in the mirror. And sometimes we don't really like what we see. I suppose when I look at my own journey in participation, I think back to when I was a teenager in this sprawling metropolis in the northeast. Does anyone recognise it from your holidays? No? You didn't go there, no? It's Cootehill, County Cavan, and it's a wonderful place. And I advise you to go there sometime and you'll be pleasantly surprised. So I'm not sure that it is known for its youth participation, but my participation when I was growing up mostly revolved around being an altar boy, a scout, and being in Ruairi. In a way, I was very much involved in the community, as were my parents and still are. And I feel quite privileged that my parents gave me those opportunities and that community leaders and volunteers gave me those opportunities. But But when I look back, do I really call it participation? Was I involved in the running, the design, the delivery of all those things? In some ways, in many ways, I was a reciprocant. And while I'm grateful for the opportunities, I would say that the culture that I was brought up in, as most people here were, was one where we were given the program and told to follow it rather than being involved or asked. So it's great to see the turning of the tide, and obviously there's a long way to go, but we are making a lot of progress. This guy here, I suppose my journey then from leaving Cootehill brought me to Scotland, where I did not drink alcohol out of a shoe, but I did drink too much alcohol. And I want to talk about alcohol specifically because I think it's one of the greatest challenges facing Ireland as a nation. I think it holds the greatest barriers to participation, and I think is one of the most underestimated and unappreciated drugs, really, in terms of what blocks people in their flourishing in life, and particularly young people. And I'm not here to say down with alcohol by any means, but when I think about me as a 16-year-old or 15, 16, 17-year-old and going to college, when I was thinking back, how did I get involved in civil society? How did I get involved? Most of my early years, of formative years, were drowned essentially in alcohol, and that in some ways is an Irish cultural phenomenon. It's common to other countries as well, but I do think we've a particular problem with it, and a particular issue with how young people become empowered as citizens in that journey. And for me, I feel it held me back an awful lot in my development. It wasn't until I left university, I moved to San Francisco, and I realized that a lot of what I had been taught at school and college wasn't necessarily how the world worked in terms of my relationship with power. And I realized that, you know, classically and historically, San Francisco is a very radicalized place. It's a place where the gay rights movement was very strong, Harvey Milk, the environmental movement is very strong. It's a place where it's a hub for innovation, for technology, a lot of spiritual thinkers. It's a place of ideas. So I felt like my university was San Francisco, where I started to meet all these people in different countries and cultures that were very much talking about power and what kind of power we have and are we participating. And sometimes protest is a manifestation of when you don't have power and when you're not being listened to, and it forces people onto the streets. I suppose after a few years of the protest movements and also getting involved in volunteering and community development, I realized that I had to get involved in also creating solutions. And it's simply, protest has a role and campaigning has a role, but we also have to be demonstrating alternatives and building. It's almost like when you oppose something, you should also propose an alternative. So I realised I want to get involved in community work and health work and with young people. And I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to work in the Northwestern Health Board in Letterkenny for a few weeks. And that few weeks became a year, and then that became a couple of years. And it was around this time when the Northwestern Health Board was being dismantled and the HSC was coming into play. And through Janet Gaynor, who's not here at the moment, I don't think, but many of you would know her from her huge passion for sex and specifically sexual health. But people who know Janet would get the reference there. But Janet is one of the best advocates for proper sexual health in Ireland. And we still don't do sexual health in Ireland. We still, in some ways, pretend it doesn't happen. And particularly in the education system, there's a lot of reform needed. So away from the just say no culture, Janet commissioned me to design a website with young people. At the time I was like 23 myself, called Clued Up. And I know Aisling Gillen's here and Celia Keenahan and various others were involved. And really we worked with young people like teenagers to develop this website, and Janet was unafraid to involve us in getting our voices heard and using me as a conduit to work with 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And so that website then allowed us to communicate with mass numbers of young people around the country, and that's in turn what led us to create spunout.ie. So I kind of like this photo because you can see the paint is falling off the wall and it looks like the 1960s or something. But for me, it kind of reflects the grassroots nature of Spun Out, because it was really a house that a community built. It wasn't really built with a lot of funding or a lot of expertise. It was just built almost as a mehel where loads of people mucked in, and and young people are from day one were very much at the core of that. And that's myself and Janet there, and you can see Celia Keenahan, who's over there. I'm going to point to her. She's actually my aunt, and that's my granny in there as well. So anyway, I don't want to be showing you a big family photo montage. And there's my cousin, my granddad as well. But one of the reasons I chose these photos is that Janet and Celia would have been probably mentor figures for me in my early 20s, in showing me and opening up the door to me for me to be involved, and not what you might call hogging the power and hogging the privilege, but distributing the privilege and distributing the power, and opening up doors for me to flourish and blossom, and to, where I wasn't qualified in social work or psychology or youth work. My degree was in business. I learned on the job, and people like this provided a mentorship role that allowed me to then provide a mentorship role and have young people involved in the running of Spun Out from the early days, where they became the ones that were presenting at conferences, and they became the advocates for change, so that the voices for change became young people. And this photo is from the last presidential election, and you can see here that I can't remember his name, Sean Gallagher, Michael D, David Norris, Mary Davis, and Martin McGuinness, the late Martin McGuinness, and various others were there as well. And really it was a youth-led event. Now the politicians might have got the front of the photo, but you can see the banner that they're holding is that we are making them own our message, and that this was very much a youth event, where we almost had to force the candidates into a room to have a debate only for young people, and young people set the agenda of the debate. And you could tell which politicians were uncomfortable with that, and which ones weren't, and which ones really wanted to engage with young people. In the post-Spun Out days, I left a few years ago, and around 2011 there was a movement called Occupy Wall Street. And at the time I was getting more and more interested in power as a whole outside of young people as well. And you would have heard a lot of talk about the 1% and the 99%. And in a way, if we look at the hierarchy of power in terms of how finance is distributed, there's a 1% at the top that is controlling the finance, and the 99%. And I suppose some of the social activism was around how can we as a 99% get involved in getting our voices heard, so that we live in a more equal world. You can see a graph here where the 6% of the world's wealth is being controlled by a very small group of people. The 6% belongs to the mass, and the 94% belongs to the very small group of people. And in a way, money is just another manifestation of power, another representation of power. And so when you have people looking for change or looking for their power and their opportunities get involved, sometimes they're coming at it from a place where they have no power, and they're being thrown essentially some scraps from the table. Now that could be financial scraps, or it could be we're going to involve you on a committee, or we're going to set up another task force, or we're going to appease you in so many different ways. So I'm talking about power a lot because I think it's essential when we think about participation. This cartoon shows that the words are, "I wouldn't be here without all of you." And again, it's like a lot of us in the room also have power. I have power because I'm on a stage, I have a microphone. Hopefully some people are listening to me, but there are many people in the room that have roles of power. In fact, most of you have roles of power, including the young people. You now have power because you're involved in this conference. You're getting opportunities to get new knowledge and new ideas, meet new people, and you have an opportunity to go home and influence your peers in your communities. And it's to be aware of what power that we have, rather than always looking above us and saying who's the guy or the girl with more power. Is like, what power do we have, and how do we own it responsibly? because it's important that we don't then sit on a pyramid with lots of people below us. So again, it's back to that looking in the mirror. Some of that is also about cultural power and how power is not obvious. You can see in this little cartoon where the Global Economic Forum is being run by essentially English speakers, and you could argue that that's whether it be the UK or the EU or the US, but how many countries in the world are not English speaking? How many of them don't have power in that way? And then when it comes time for them to participate, they're told they have to maybe present in English. Now, this is just one example, but we might look at applying to it for our work with young people. So do we ask them to present or to engage in a way that is only in our language, the way that we understand, or do we adapt to their needs and distribute power and learn from them as well? And I know you've looked at a lot of this throughout the day, and I know many of you have already gone through the training, and it feels to me that TUSLA is very much on this journey in terms of waking up to your power as social workers, youth workers, managers, people with power and influence. So you may have noticed the title of the presentation was around a fear of, that young people might burn down the building. And I kind of was thinking about what is it about participation and why are there so many blocks to young people being allowed to participate or being asked to participate. And I just got this notion that at some level people, and maybe it's a natural position, particularly also for parents, and I'm not a parent myself and I don't underestimate the challenges when you might leave the young people at home or with power, with responsibility, that they might burn down the building. And then when it comes time to running or designing a service, that you might have a fear of all these things that might happen and that they might burn down the service. And I think that in some ways taps into this notion of fear. And in many ways, a lot of our systems and a lot of our cultural influences have increasingly become based on fear. Fear of all the things that might be said or might not be said, or all the things that might go wrong. But fear is such a disempowering emotion. Now, fear can be useful because it can alert you to danger. And it's not to say that you would leave a 13-year-old in charge of the building. But it is important to be aware of how fear can be a disabling force for all of us, and that it might be a subconscious element. So I was looking for some memes or quotes around young people, and I found this within 30 seconds. Some smart arse went and designed this. Welcome to the magical world of teenagers, backtalks, mood swings, crazy behaviour, continuous mind changes, lies, sneakiness. Like, who had the time to go and do this? And what motivated them? Because at some level, we presume it was an adult, and we presume that they were a teenager themselves one time, and that they've now got themselves into their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and they've some spare time on their hands to design memes for the internet. But in some ways, it reflects a sneery type attitude towards young people that can be prevalent sometimes in the media. And this idea that, sure, young people, what would they know? Aren't they all just this and that, all that? And that they're just full of hormones. And sure, they're the most self-obsessed generation now, and they have everything handed to them and all this kind of stuff. Every generation has its own challenges. And I would say that whereas today's generation, not all of them, but a lot of them are materially looked after, that one of the great wars on young people at the moment is a psychological one. And I suppose the internet is the battleground in one way, and that the duress and stress and anxiety being felt throughout that is quite severe. So rather than having this kind of judgmental view of young people that now I'm old, I'm no longer a teenager, I can look down on young people because I now have power, they're lost over there. Is that we can sort of have a compassionate view of young people and remember ourselves when we were that age, and know that the challenges that young people face today are just simply different than the ones that we might have faced. In some ways, I feel that there's this kind of fear of our shadows and fear of young people that in many ways is imaginary, because once young people are given opportunities and given power, 99% of the time they will come good. And maybe the 99% isn't accurate, maybe it's 90%, but the vast majority of times the shadow monster will not appear, and that young people will reward us. I think it's important to mentor young people, particularly young men, but also obviously young women, from boyhood to manhood, so that they can learn what power is and what responsibility is, particularly in terms of gender equality. Cultural phenomena of power in that different cultures around the world always looked at youth in terms of how we did rites of passage work with young people. In Ireland, back to alcohol, I feel that in some ways our alcohol is our rites to passage when you become an adult in Ireland. Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. There you go. So back to the title of the talk. This is an African proverb: if the young are not initiated into the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth. And so when we think about why are there so many social problems or problems with or by or from young people, maybe they just want the warmth of the village. And I remember researching that in the early days of looking into rites of passage, and I saw this article around the same day where on, I think it was the same evening, 2 different buildings, a youth centre and a GA club, were burnt down. And it was actually a 19-year-old that was arrested for it. And it got me thinking, what was that young man's story? And was he trying to find the warmth of the village by burning it down? So I have a quote by Spielberg there in terms of the opportunity not to recreate young people in our image, but to allow them to create their own image. So I'm not going to go back over the territory that we covered today, but in terms of the right to be heard and the ladder of participation and the Lundy model, I think so much of it is really about young people at the heart, which TUSLA has promised to deliver on, which is signed up to, which is in the different conventions, which is in the strategies, which is in the policies, which is in the legislation. But it needs to be more than that. It needs to be an attitude. And so when we've all been in this meeting, when we've been asked our opinions by management and staff, or management about, are we being listened to? And I think that's a challenge for TUSLA management as well, and for TUSLA staff to say, are you being involved in your own jobs? And are you being involved in the running of the organisation? And are you being involved as citizens in the running of the country? That goes back to the proclamation. This is not a new issue. These are things people talked about over 100 years ago. You all have a lot of power, a lot of responsibility, a lot of privilege, and I would say amongst the most vulnerable groups of people that many of you work with. Homeless people, many of them have been in care, as you know, and that statistic is still true. Every day that goes by, the homeless crisis grows, and more of them people have been in care. And I think you are the gatekeepers, and that so much is possible when you mentor, support, and guide these young people towards what I see as a true democracy that is not just about voting, but it's about women's participation, men's participation, young people's participation, participations of people with disabilities. I think this quote by Helen Keller about it's a feeling in your heart, I think participation needs to be more than a policy and more than something that you feel you have to tick the box. It actually has to be something that you believe in your heart, and that if a young person doesn't feel that, then it's not real. So it's about you delivering that. And I think that from what I've seen and heard and read, TUSLA has the opportunity, and Ireland has the opportunity to be a world leader, truly. But if we don't believe that, it won't happen. But we can be a world leader, and we need to be a world leader, because look at our history. Look at what's gone on with the Tune babies. Look at how many scandals around children does one small country need, and that we can be this best country for young people in the world. Why not? But really what all of us need is courage to try new things, to distribute power, to rattle the cage where necessary, and to look in the mirror. And not to see this as an ordeal, but to see this really as an adventure that we're all on together, and that we will make mistakes, but we have to keep trying and bang the drum when you can as well. So thank you.